The last time I saw Vivian Blake smile, federal agents were wrapping steel handcuffs around her wrists. The grand ballroom was completely silent. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen tears. Champagne glasses stayed frozen in the air, held by hundreds of Manhattan's wealthiest people who had suddenly stopped moving. Nobody breathed. Nobody spoke. Every eye in that room moved back and forth between me, standing calmly behind the podium on stage, and the front table, where the woman who had spent 15 years stealing my entire life finally understood that it was over. But the most chilling part of that moment? Vivian still looked confused. Even as the people around her pulled away in disgust. Even as the cold metal clicked against her wrists. She stared up at me with wide, lost eyes. After 15 years of careful manipulation. After destroying my marriage. After draining my late father's multi-million-dollar real estate empire. After sleeping beside my husband in the bed I once called my own. She still did not understand the rules of the game we had been playing. She thought she was a brilliant thief. She did not realize she was just bait. I adjusted the microphone. The sound cut sharply through the silence. The elegant gala, with all its gold and candlelight and expensive perfume, no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like something else entirely. Alexander Reed, my ex-husband, sat beside her at the front table. His face had gone completely white. His hands were shaking so badly that he dropped his fountain pen onto the tablecloth. They had come tonight believing they were celebrating their greatest victory. The 15th anniversary of Sterling and Reed Luxury Estates. Their empire. Their life. They thought I was a broken woman who had come to make one last sad speech before disappearing forever. I looked directly at Vivian's pale face. I smiled slowly. And I spoke. Vivian didn't steal my life overnight. She auditioned for it for 15 years. My name is Serena Whitlock. And this is the story of how my best friend spent 15 years stealing my life, before I destroyed hers in a single night. To understand what happened in that ballroom, you have to go back to the very beginning. You have to go back to the moment the whole thing started. Because it did not start with fraud or forged documents or affairs. It started at my wedding. It started with a bouquet of white roses and a look in my best friend's eyes that I should have understood immediately. But I didn't. And that is on me. Vivian Blake and I met during our first year at Columbia University. From the outside, we were an unusual pair. I was a Whitlock. My father, Charles Whitlock, had built one of the most respected real estate companies in New York from the ground up. I grew up in quiet, well-kept rooms, taught from childhood that real wealth is silent, that discretion matters more than display, and that emotional outbursts are a sign of weakness. Vivian was the opposite of all of that. She came from a working-class family with no safety net and no connections. She was loud and magnetic and walked into every room like she owned it. People were drawn to her immediately. I was drawn to her too. She had an energy I had never been around before, bright and restless and completely alive. I thought we balanced each other perfectly. She thought so too. Just not for the reasons I believed. We became inseparable. And because I had always had more than enough, I shared without thinking. I covered her half of our off-campus rent when her shifts at the restaurant fell short. I bought her dresses for university events and called them birthday gifts so she would never feel out of place among my wealthy friends. I opened every door my family name could open and pulled her through with me. I thought that was what friendship meant. I thought we were building something that would last our whole lives. During our final year at university, I met Alexander Reed. He was a young, ambitious broker, no famous family name, but tremendous charm and a hunger for success that reminded me of the self-made men in my father's history books. When I introduced him to my father, Charles Whitlock studied him with the quiet, careful eyes he used for people he was not yet sure about. That evening, my father pulled me aside. "The boy has sharp teeth, Serena," he said quietly. "Make sure he only bites what you tell him to." I was 24 years old and completely in love. I smiled and told my father he worried too much. I was wrong. Our wedding was the social event of the season. The venue was our family estate overlooking the Hudson River. White gardenias covered every surface. The jazz band played softly. The guest list included half of Manhattan's business world. It was the kind of wedding that appeared in magazines, and eventually did. Vivian was my maid of honor. She stood closest to me throughout the ceremony. She cried during the vows. She hugged me so tightly before I walked down the aisle that I felt it in my bones. And when Alexander slipped the ring onto my finger, she pressed her hand against her heart and mouthed the words "I love you" from across the altar. I believed every bit of it. At the reception, the band played on and the guests filled the grand rooms of the estate with laughter and champagne. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for, the bouquet toss. I stood on the curved staircase above the crowd, holding the bundle of white roses above my head. Below me, a crowd of women had gathered, laughing, nudging each other, pretending they didn't care while clearly caring very much. Vivian was at the front. She had pushed her way past the other bridesmaids and was standing with her eyes fixed on the bouquet in my hands. Not smiling the way the others were smiling. Just watching. Still and focused and completely locked in. I turned my back. I counted to 3. I threw the bouquet over my shoulder. I turned around. Vivian was holding the bouquet above her head with both hands. Her grip was so tight that the white petals were already crushing under her fingers, moisture squeezing out of the stems. Her face was flushed. Her chest was rising and falling quickly. And she was not looking at me, or the crowd, or any of the laughing guests around her. She was looking directly at Alexander. He was standing near the bar across the room, laughing at something with my father's business partners. He had no idea she was staring at him. But Vivian's eyes were fixed on him with an intensity that made my stomach drop without warning. "I'm next," she shouted across the room. The guests laughed. Someone clapped. The moment passed the way moments do at weddings, quickly, covered over by music and champagne and the general warmth of the evening. I walked down the stairs toward her, trying to push away the cold feeling settling into my chest. "You nearly tore the roses apart, Viv," I said lightly, trying to laugh. She looked at me. And in less than a second, the intense expression vanished, completely and perfectly replaced by her warm, familiar smile. She wrapped her arms around me and laughed into my shoulder. "Oh honey, you know me," she said. "When I see something beautiful that I want, I just can't let it go." The guests moved on. The music continued. The night carried forward the way beautiful nights do, and by the time Alexander and I danced for the last time before leaving, I had almost forgotten the feeling entirely. Almost. Because somewhere underneath all the happiness of that evening, that small cold feeling stayed in my chest. Quiet and still and patient. Looking back now, I know exactly what it was. It was the truth arriving early. Vivian was not celebrating my happiness that night. She was not admiring the life I had built. She was studying it. The layout of the estate. The behavior of the executives in the room. The emotional patterns of my new husband. The exact weight of the Whitlock name and everything attached to it. She was reading the blueprint of my life. And she was already calculating how long it would take to make it hers. The copying started so small that I questioned my own mind before I questioned her. About 3 months after the wedding, Vivian showed up to our regular Saturday coffee with her hair cut in the exact same style as mine. Same length. Same layers. Same soft wave at the ends. I noticed it and said nothing. I told myself it was a coincidence. We had known each other for years. Our tastes overlapping made sense. Then the perfume. One evening she leaned in to hug me. "Goodbye." And the scent hit me like a reflection of myself. It was not a common fragrance. It was something my father had brought back from France years earlier, something I had worn for so long it felt like part of me. I had mentioned it to Vivian once, briefly, in passing. She had remembered. Then the clothes. Similar colors. Similar cuts. Never an exact copy, she was always careful about that. But close enough that I knew. Close enough that I could see what was happening even while I talked myself out of believing it. People started noticing. You two could be sisters. Vivian, you sound just like Serena sometimes. Are you two spending too much time together? You're finishing each other's sentences. Everyone said it warmly, as if it was a compliment. And Vivian would laugh and squeeze my hand and look at me like I was the most important person in the room. I smiled along with it. But at night, lying in bed while Alexander slept, I stared at the ceiling and felt that cold weight in my chest getting slightly heavier. What worried me more than the hair and the clothes was how completely Vivian had made herself part of my family's daily life. It happened so gradually, I cannot name a single moment when it became too much. She started spending more evenings at our house than her own apartment. She began babysitting my daughter Emily without being asked, volunteering so naturally that refusing felt rude. She helped organize charity events. She ran errands. She remembered details that I hadn't even asked her to remember: Alexander's favorite wine, Emily's bedtime routine, my father's medication schedule when his health was poor. She made herself necessary. And she was so warm and giving about all of it that questioning her felt like an attack on someone innocent. What I was not seeing, what I was not yet ready to see, was what Vivian was doing with Alexander during those long evenings at our house. She was listening to him. That sounds simple. But I want you to understand what I mean. She listened the way a person listens when they are trying to learn something important. She asked him questions about his work and his frustrations and his ambitions. She nodded slowly and said things like, "You see things that other people completely miss, Alexander. I honestly don't understand why the board doesn't give you more credit. You carry so much of this company. A man with your vision deserves more than what he's getting." I heard these things in passing and told myself Vivian was simply being kind. Supportive. Wasn't that what good friends did? But Alexander was beginning to believe her. Slowly. Steadily. He became quieter at home. Further away. When I spoke to him about family plans or company decisions, he listened with half his attention. But when Vivian was in the room, he was a different person. He laughed louder. He sat straighter. He told longer stories with more energy than I had seen from him in months. One evening we were all sitting in the living room after dinner. The lights were low. Emily was already asleep upstairs. Vivian said something, I cannot even remember what, and Alexander laughed so hard he had to put his glass down. I watched him laugh. And I realized, sitting in my own home, that I had not heard that sound from him in a very long time. It was a small crack. Almost invisible. But cracks have a way of growing. The first real warning came through money. I had organized a charity fundraiser, a community library project connected to Sterling and Reed. I had worked on it personally for almost a year. I chose the location. I met the community leaders. I organized the fundraising dinner. And I asked Vivian to handle the finances, because she was organized and capable and I trusted her completely. 3 months later, my father's accountant flagged something during a routine review. A portion of the funds was missing. The paperwork was incomplete. The trail was deliberately unclear. I called Vivian the same day. I gave her every chance to explain it simply. I wanted a reasonable answer. I wanted her to say there had been an error, a misunderstanding, something that made sense. She didn't give me one. Instead, she arrived at my house that evening already crying. She stepped through the door, wrapped her arms around me before I could speak, and trembled against my shoulder like a frightened child. "Serena, please. You're my sister. I would never betray you. You know who I am. You know me." The tears were real. The shaking was real. Every single thing about her seemed genuine and devastated and sorry. She explained it away as panic. Poor decisions. Temporarily moving money between accounts, intending to fix it before anyone noticed. She called it a mistake. She begged me not to tell my father. She begged me not to tell Alexander. And I forgave her. Because she was my sister in every way except blood. Because the idea of her being dishonest felt more painful than the missing money. Because I loved her. She left that night looking relieved. I sat alone in my living room and tried to believe I had done the right thing. Later, my father knocked on my study door. Charles Whitlock sat across from me, folded his hands on his knee the way he always did when something important needed to be said, and looked at me for a long moment. "I know you spoke with Vivian tonight," he said quietly. I was surprised. I hadn't told him anything. I asked how he knew. He didn't answer that. He just leaned forward slightly. "Serena. I want you to remember something. Never trust people who admire your life more than they admire you." He let the words sit. There is a difference between someone who loves you and someone who loves what surrounds you. One will protect you. The other will wait. He kissed the top of my head and left the room. I sat there for a long time in the silence after he was gone. I should have listened. I should have listened that same night, locked the doors, and changed everything. But love makes people slow. And I still loved Vivian like she was my own blood. So I folded my father's words away into the back of my mind like a letter I was not yet ready to open. And nothing changed. Except that everything was already changing, quietly, carefully, and completely without my knowledge. I can see now exactly how it was done. It was not sudden or dramatic. It was the way a room grows cold, so slowly and steadily that you don't notice until you're already shivering and can't remember when the warmth disappeared. Vivian joined Sterling and Reed officially about a year after the charity incident. She came into the events and communications department through a position quietly recommended by Alexander. At the time I was happy about it. Having her nearby felt comfortable. Safe. I did not yet understand that she had been planning this move for years. Once she was inside the company, Vivian worked the way she worked at everything, carefully, patiently, and with tremendous attention to the people around her. She learned names quickly. She remembered details about everyone's birthdays, children's names, personal troubles mentioned once in passing. She stayed late. She volunteered for difficult tasks. She made herself useful to everyone who held influence. She was building loyalty. Quietly. Deliberately. And while she built, I simply existed, the way a person exists in their own home, without thinking to perform for it. I had grown up inside that company. I had been there before most of the staff were hired. I had never needed to campaign for people's trust because I assumed it was already there. That assumption was the crack Vivian walked through. While I existed, she campaigned. She was especially careful with the board members, older men who had known my father for decades and had always been slightly uncomfortable with the idea of a young woman eventually running everything. She was warm with them in ways I had never thought to be. She laughed at their jokes. She asked for their opinions and listened like those opinions were treasures. Slowly, without my noticing, their decisions began to involve Vivian's name more and more. At home, Alexander continued to change. Quieter. Harder to reach. When I raised concerns about his distance, about what I was feeling, he looked at me with an expression I can only describe as tired. Like I was a problem he did not have enough energy for. But around Vivian he was sharp, bright, and fully present. And Vivian had done something else, something more calculated than the clothes or the perfume or the board meetings. She had made me look unstable by comparison. Not by saying cruel things about me directly. That was never her method. Her method was quieter and more effective. When I raised concerns in meetings, she responded with such calm and careful logic that I seemed emotional by contrast. When I was tired or frustrated or simply human, Vivian was always composed. Always the steady, reasonable voice in the room. People stopped looking to me when they needed calm. And they started looking at me with quiet worry. The hardest moment did not happen in a boardroom. It happened at home, on an ordinary afternoon. Emily was 6 years old and going through a difficult time, crying some mornings before school, coming home quiet, struggling to settle. I was worried about her. I spent evenings on the edge of her bed reading to her, talking softly, trying to reach her. One afternoon I came home earlier than expected. I was going to surprise her. Take her somewhere special. I came through the front door quietly. From upstairs I heard voices of Vivian's and Emily's. Laughter. Vivian was doing all the character voices in a story, making Emily shriek and giggle in the happy, carefree way children do when they feel completely safe. I stood in the entrance hall and listened. Then Emily said 4 words. 4 words that I have never fully recovered from, even now, even after everything that came later. I wish Vivian was my real mom. I did not move. I stood at the bottom of the stairs with my coat still on and my hand on the banister, and I felt something inside me go very, very quiet. Not break. Not shatter. Quiet. The way something goes quiet when it is already over. I eventually walked to the kitchen. I put the kettle on. I stood at the window looking at the garden and told myself that children say things. That Emily loved me. That she was only 6 and did not understand the weight of her own words. I told myself many things. But I never forgot those 4 words. And from that afternoon, something in me began to shift, slowly, in the dark, like a tide going out. Not yet visible. But moving. I have replayed the board meeting many times. I have looked for the moment I could have stopped it. Said something different. Moved differently. Chosen another path. I have never found it. Because by the time that meeting happened, the outcome had already been decided. The votes had been counted in private conversations and quiet dinners I was never invited to. The meeting itself was just the announcement. Just the door closing on something that had already ended. It began with a financial scandal attached to my name. Documents surfaced suggesting that funds had been mismanaged on a major development project I had been overseeing. The paperwork showed poor oversight. Corners cut. Decisions made without approval. The kind of thing that was not just financially irresponsible but potentially criminal. I had not done any of it. The documents were real. But the signatures were not mine, not exactly. They were close enough to create serious doubt. Close enough to be completely convincing to people who were already looking for a reason. I did not know yet who had created those documents. I know now. The board meeting was called on a Tuesday morning. I walked in prepared to defend myself. I walked in expecting a hard conversation between people who knew me. What I found was a room full of people who had already made up their minds. The accusations were laid out calmly. The documents were presented one by one. Then Alexander stood up. My husband stood in front of every senior member of my father's company and did not defend me. He said, and I remember every word with complete clarity, that given the seriousness of the concerns, it was in the company's best interest for Serena Whitlock to step back from operational control while a full investigation was conducted. He said it professionally. Calmly. Like he was talking about someone he had never met. He did not look at me once. Vivian sat 3 seats away, her eyes on the table, her expression carefully arranged into something that looked like reluctant sadness. Like someone attending a funeral they wished had not been necessary. The vote was taken. I lost. I was removed from operational control of Sterling and Reed Luxury Estates. My father's company. The company that had his name woven into every wall of it. The company I had grown up inside of and dedicated my adult life to. I drove home in silence. 3 weeks later, Alexander sat across from me at the kitchen table and told me he wanted a divorce. He used careful, reasonable words. The marriage had not been working. They had grown apart. It was better for Emily to have 2 happy separated parents than 2 unhappy ones together. He used the word they several times. I asked him if he was talking about himself and Vivian. He looked away. That was all the answer I needed. The tabloids found the story within weeks. I still do not know who made the call, though I have my suspicions. Headlines appeared that I had never imagined for myself. Whitlock heiress ousted from family empire. The fall of Serena Whitlock. Fraud allegations rock Sterling and Reed. I stopped reading after the third article. Within 6 months, Vivian had moved into my home. My house. The place where I raised my daughter and built my marriage and hosted dinners for people I believed were my friends. She moved in slowly, the way she did everything, her presence expanding into the spaces I had left behind, until there was no trace of me remaining. A year after the board meeting, Vivian and Alexander appeared in a magazine. Photographed together at a charity gala, the same kind of event I used to organize. The caption described them as the city's most exciting new power couple. I was not in the photograph. I was not in the city. I had disappeared. People assumed I disappeared because I had lost everything. The truth was something different entirely. I disappeared because I finally understood exactly who Vivian Blake was. And once I understood that, I knew precisely what needed to be done. I want to be clear about something. I did not disappear to grieve. I disappeared to work. I moved quietly to a smaller city 3 hours away. I rented a modest apartment. I bought simple furniture and cooked my own meals and lived in a way that no one who had known Serena Whitlock would have recognized. That was exactly the point. I needed Vivian and Alexander to feel certain they had one. Completely and permanently. I needed them to relax, because comfortable people get careless, and careless people leave trails. I was counting on it. My first call was to a forensic accounting firm recommended by a retired judge who had known my father for 30 years. I explained what I suspected. I explained what I needed to find. They began working within the week. What they found over the following months was extraordinary. The financial scandal had not been a simple lie. It had been a carefully constructed operation. Forged signatures. Funds moved through shell companies that existed only on paper. Offshore transfers carefully designed to make embezzlement look like it pointed in my direction while hiding where the money actually went. It was sophisticated. It had been built over time, layer by careful layer, by someone who understood the company's financial systems from deep inside. Alexander. But he had not worked alone. The investigators uncovered a second set of records, buried so deeply that months of work were required to surface them. Vivian had been running a parallel financial operation alongside the company's official accounts since almost the beginning of her time at Sterling and Reed. Small amounts at first. Then larger. Using her access to events and communications to move money in ways that looked like ordinary expenses, catering invoices, venue deposits. Contractor fees. Each transaction just small enough to avoid automatic review. 15 years. She had been doing it, in various forms, for nearly 15 years. And then the investigators found something else. Something that changed everything. My father had known something was coming. Not specifically. Not with names or a full picture. But Charles Whitlock, who had spent his entire life watching people carefully and trusting very few, had made a quiet decision years before his health began to fail. He had moved the true core of the family's wealth, the original properties, the foundational assets, the holdings that the entire company had been built upon, into a series of private trusts. Trusts that only I could access. Trusts that were completely disconnected from Sterling and Reed's official structure, hidden behind layers of legal protection built quietly and patiently over years, with attorneys who had never heard of Vivian Blake and had never met Alexander Reed. My father had known. Not everything. But enough. Never trust people who admire your life more than they admire you. He had not just been warning me with those words. He had been protecting me. What Vivian and Alexander had taken over was real. The company name, the offices, the contracts, the reputation, the social status, all of it was genuinely theirs. And they had spent 3 years expanding on it, appearing in magazines, living the life they had stolen with visible confidence. But the foundation, the original wealth beneath everything, was untouched. Protected. Unreachable. They had stolen the house. My father had quietly moved the ground it stood on. And what neither of them knew was that the empire they were so proudly running was drowning in hidden debt created by their own financial manipulations, now carefully documented by investigators who were preparing to hand it to federal authorities. The collapse was already written. It just needed someone to deliver it at the right moment. I sat in my small apartment 3 hours from the city, read the final investigator's report from beginning to end, and felt something settle inside me that I had not felt in years. Not anger. Not sadness. Clarity. I picked up my phone. I need to organize a gala, I said. Something generous. Something impressive. The kind of event that Vivian Blake and Alexander Reed would never dream of missing. I paused. I need them in the front row. The night of the gala arrived cold and clear. I had spent 3 months organizing it from a distance through trusted people whose names meant nothing to Vivian or Alexander. The venue was one of the most prestigious ballrooms in Manhattan. The guest list included every board member, every business associate, every journalist and socialite that Vivian and Alexander had carefully collected over 3 years of their borrowed success. The invitation was sent under a foundation name. A charitable evening celebrating innovation in luxury property development. Exactly the kind of event Vivian lived for, the kind where she could wear a beautiful gown and stand beside Alexander and let people photograph her and feel like she had completely and permanently arrived. She accepted within 2 days. I watched from a car across the street as the guests arrived. I watched Vivian step out in her red gown, laughing at something Alexander said, adjusting her hair before walking through the entrance. She looked radiant. She looked completely at ease. She looked like a woman who had never once lost a night of sleep over anything she had done. I waited 10 minutes. Then I went inside. I stood near the back of the room for almost an hour, watching quietly. When Vivian finally noticed me across the ballroom, the color left her face instantly. She leaned toward Alexander and spoke quickly. He turned and found me with his eyes. I raised my glass slightly in their direction. Neither of them moved. Good. I waited until the room was at its fullest. Until the champagne had been flowing long enough that people were warm and relaxed and completely unsuspecting. Then I walked to the stage and picked up the microphone. Vivian didn't steal my life overnight. She auditioned for it for 15 years. The room went silent. I kept my voice calm and level. I kept my face still. I was not angry, I want you to understand that clearly. Anger would have made me look desperate. What I felt standing at that microphone was something far more powerful than anger. I began at the beginning. I told the room about the bouquet and the hunger I had seen in Vivian's eyes on my wedding day. I told them about the slow copying, the hair, the perfume, the clothes, the speech patterns. I told them about the missing charity money and the forgiveness I gave too easily. I told them about Emily, aged 6, saying she wished Vivian was her real mother. The room was completely still. Then the screens along the walls lit up. Months of documentation filled every screen in the ballroom, forensic accounting records, offshore account details, shell company registrations, forged signatures, hidden financial transfers. Bank records. Email chains. Dates. Numbers. Names. All of it displayed in large, clear, undeniable format for every person in that room to see. Alexander stood up from his table. You need to stop. His voice was trying to sound commanding. It came out thin and hollow. I funded this gala, I said calmly into the microphone. The technical team works for me. The screens stay on. He sat back down. Vivian had not moved from her chair. She sat perfectly still, staring at the screens, and for the first time in 15 years I saw her without any mask at all. No warm smile. No practiced composure. No performance. Just a woman sitting in the ruins of a plan she had believed was perfect, watching every piece of it come apart at once. I told the room about the trusts. I explained clearly and without triumph that the foundational assets of the Whitlock family had never been part of Sterling and Reed's official structure. That they had been protected years ago through legal instruments that Vivian and Alexander had no knowledge of and no access to whatsoever. That the empire they had been confidently running for 3 years had been built on ground they had never actually owned. I watched the realization move across Vivian's face. Slowly. Completely. Like weather. She understood, in that moment, that she had spent 15 years working towards something. Had destroyed a real friendship, had discarded her own integrity, had hurt a child, had committed crimes, all for something that had been hollow at its very center the entire time. She had stolen a beautiful house built on sand. And the tide had finally come in. The side doors of the ballroom opened. The 3 men in dark suits walked in. Vivian turned and saw them. She stood up so quickly her chair scraped violently across the floor. She reached for Alexander's arm. He stepped back from her, a small, almost invisible movement. But she saw it. And I saw it too. I leaned toward the microphone one final time. You wanted my life so badly, Vivian. You never realized I stopped living inside it years ago. I paused. You didn't steal my empire. You inherited its collapse. I did not watch them take her. I turned away from the stage before the investigators reached Vivian's table. I had said everything that needed to be said. The rest, the arrest, the shouting, the photographs that would fill every newspaper by morning, I did not need to see. I walked to the back of the ballroom. I collected my coat. I pushed open a side door and stepped outside. The night was cool. A soft rain had started, not heavy, just a quiet mist that settled on my coat and my hair and made the streetlights blurry and warm-looking. The noise from inside faded behind me as the door closed. Then there was just the rain. I stood on the pavement outside the ballroom and breathed. I thought about my father. Charles Whitlock had died 14 months earlier, quietly, in the hospital, with my hand in his and his eyes calm and clear until the very end. He had not lived to see this night. He had not seen his words proven right in the most public way possible. But he had built the protection that made this night possible. And I believe, in the careful, watchful part of him that never trusted easily, he had always known I would find my way back. I thought about Emily. 9 years old now. Living with me. Adjusting. Laughing more. Making friends slowly, in the careful way that children do after hard years. She still asked about her father sometimes. I answered her honestly, in the ways a 9-year-old can carry. I thought about the woman I had been 15 years ago, standing on a curved staircase in a white dress, tossing flowers over her shoulder, laughing and believing with everything she had that the world around her was exactly what it looked like. I did not feel sorry for that woman. She had been real. She had been warm and open and trusting. And those were never weaknesses, no matter how the story turned out. The problem had never been that I loved too freely. The problem had been one specific person who decided, from almost the very beginning, to use that love as a stepping stone. That was Vivian's failure. Not mine. I started walking. The street was quiet. The rain was soft. The city spread out ahead of me, ordinary and indifferent and full of people who had no idea what had just happened in that ballroom. Traffic lights changed for nobody. Windows glowed with the lives of strangers. I walked toward all of it without hurrying. I had no celebration planned. No champagne waiting somewhere. No friends gathered to cheer. That had never been the point. The point had never been victory. The point had been making sure that what my father spent his entire life building was not consumed by people who had earned none of it. The point had been making sure the truth existed somewhere outside of my own memory. That was done now. I was 41 years old. I had lost a marriage. I had lost a best friend. I had lost 3 years of my daughter's early childhood and the daily presence of a father I loved more than I ever said out loud. But somewhere in the shadow years, in the small apartment, in the investigators' reports, in the long quiet nights of careful and patient work, I had found something unexpected. Myself. Not the version that lived inside a beautiful house with a carefully selected wardrobe and a husband being slowly turned against her. Not the version the tabloids had turned into a headline. Not the version that Vivian had spent 15 years studying and copying and eventually trying to erase. Just me. Serena Whitlock. The woman my father raised to be clear-eyed and patient and strong enough to wait for the right moment. I pulled my coat a little tighter against the rain. And I kept walking. The saddest part was never losing my best friend. It was realizing she had never wanted love. She had wanted possession. And stolen lives eventually rot in the hands of the thief.